Sometimes the measure of a man isn't what he keeps, but what he's willing to give up. In the lawless borderlands where mercy was rare and justice scarcer still, one cowboy would face a choice that defined everything. Jebediah Old Hat Miller was riding the trails when his German shepherd Scout bolted toward an abandoned trestle bridge. Beneath the weathered wood lay three young sisters bound, blindfolded, left to die. They were the magistrate's daughters, taken by a ruthless gang as a warning. But what Old Hat found wasn't just three terrified children. It was a trap. The outlaws were watching from the brush, waiting to ambush anyone foolish enough to help. What would you sacrifice to save innocent life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jebediah Miller earned the name Old Hat, not from vanity, but from the sweat-stained, weather-beaten Stetson he'd worn for near about 20 years. The hat had seen better days, much like the man beneath it. At 68 years old, his face carried the deep lines of a hard life lived under an unforgiving sun. His beard had gone silver years ago, but his eyes pale, blue and sharp, as broken glass still held the keen awareness of a man who'd spent decades reading the land and the people who crossed it. Those eyes had seen things most men only heard about in whispered tales around campfires. They'd witnessed the chaos of war, the brutality of outlaws, and the quiet dignity of good people trying to make honest lives in a place that didn't much care about honesty. They'd also seen love, real and true, though that felt like a lifetime ago now. Old Hat had been a Texas Ranger for nearly 30 years. He'd tracked killers across 3 territories, brought in cattle rustlers, broken up smuggling rings, and earned a reputation as a man who didn't quit once he took up a trail. His hands, calloused and scarred, had held a badge with pride. They'd also held his wife Sarah's hand as she took her last breath 10 years ago, and that was when everything changed. Sarah had been the kind of woman who made hard men gentle and gentle men strong. She'd had a way of seeing the good in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. When Old Hat came home from long weeks on the trail, dusty and tired and sometimes bloodied, she never asked him to be anything other than what he was. She'd tend his wounds, feed him supper, and sit with him on their porch while he told her about the places he'd been. She never judged, never demanded he leave the Rangers, never made him choose between duty and home. She understood that some men are called to stand between the darkness and the light, and she loved him for being one of them. When the fever took her, it happened fast. One week she was tending her garden, pressing wildflowers between the pages of books, humming old hymns. The next, she was burning up with sickness that no doctor could name or cure. Old Hat sat beside her bed for 3 days straight, holding her hand, whispering promises he knew he couldn't keep. When she finally slipped away, something in him broke that no amount of time could mend. He turned in his badge 6 months later. Couldn't see the point anymore. All those years of chasing bad men, bringing them to justice, protecting folks who needed protecting, it all felt hollow without Sarah waiting for him at the end of the trail. So he sold their small ranch, packed what little he owned into a pair of saddlebags, and took to drifting. That was 10 years ago, and he'd been moving ever since. He worked when he needed to ranch hand, trail guide, sometimes security for wagon trains crossing dangerous territory. He never stayed anywhere longer than a season. Home was wherever he made camp for the night, and his only constant companion was Scout. The German shepherd had come into his life 5 years back, a half-starved pup someone had abandoned on the side of a trail. Old Hat had given him water and jerky, figuring the dog would wander off once his belly was full. Instead, Scout followed him for 3 days straight, never straying more than a few yards away. By the 4th day, Old Hat stopped trying to shoo him off. By the end of the first week, he couldn't imagine traveling without him. Scout was 7 now, lean and powerful, with a black and tan coat that gleamed when the sun hit it right. He had the intelligence of a working dog and the loyalty of a creature who understood he'd been given a second chance at life. Old Hat had trained him well, taught him to track, to alert, to attack on command, and to stand down just as quick. But more than the training, there was an understanding between them that went deeper than words. Scout could read Old Hat's moods, sensed danger before it showed itself, and knew when to press close for comfort in the lonely hours after dark. Together, they traveled the borderlands, that vast stretch of territory between Texas and Mexico, where the law was more suggestion than rule. It was 1880, and while the cities back east were filling with electric lights and progress, out here life moved at the same pace it had for generations. Towns were few and far between, separated by miles of scrub brush, rocky hills, and desert that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. Water was precious, shade was scarce, and trust was something you earned drop by drop. Old Hat knew this land better than most. He knew which water holes still ran clean, which passes through the mountains were safe this time of year, which cantinas would serve a man without asking too many questions. He knew the names of outlaws working both sides of the border, knew their methods, their habits, their favorite hiding places. Even retired, he kept that knowledge sharp. Old habits died hard, and some part of him would always be a ranger, even without the badge. His possessions were few but carefully chosen. A good horse, a buckskin gelding named Copper, 15 hands high and steady as sunrise, a Henry rifle in a saddle scabbard, cleaned and oiled every night, a Navy Colt revolver, 36 caliber, worn smooth from years of use but deadly accurate in his hands. The gun had been a gift from his ranger captain 20 years back, given after Old Hat saved the man's life in a shootout with bandits. It had never failed him. In his saddlebags he carried the essentials: coffee, beans, bacon wrapped in cheesecloth, hardtack, ammunition, a whetstone, matches wrapped in oilcloth, a spare shirt, and a bedroll. He also carried something less practical but infinitely more precious, a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with sketches of wanted men, notes on trail conditions, and pressed wildflowers Sarah had collected. He couldn't bear to throw them away. Some nights, he'd open that journal by firelight and trace his fingers over those flowers, remembering her humming in the garden, the way she'd smile when she found a particularly beautiful bloom. The journal also held her wedding ring, kept on a leather cord. He'd tried wearing it around his neck for a while after she passed, but the weight of it felt wrong, like he was carrying guilt instead of love. So he kept it safe in the journal instead, taking it out only on the hardest nights when the loneliness got too heavy to bear. He'd been working a ranch about 60 miles south for the past 3 months, helping with a cattle drive, and then staying on to mend fences and break horses. It was honest work, and the pay was fair, 3 months' wages in gold dust, enough to see him through the winter if he was careful. He'd collected it just yesterday, the heavy leather pouch now secured deep in his saddlebag. It represented security, supplies, maybe a warm room in a boarding house when the cold weather came. It was everything he owned in the world, distilled down to one small bag of gleaming metal. This morning, he'd set out early, planning to ride northeast toward a town called Esperanza. He'd heard they might need someone to help with security, some trouble with rustlers or maybe smugglers. It didn't much matter. Work was work, and the borderlands always had plenty of it for a man with his skills. The day had started peaceful enough. Dawn broke clear and golden over the hills, painting the landscape in shades of amber and rust. The air was still cool, carrying the scent of sage and creosote. Scout trotted alongside Copper, tongue lolling, happy as a dog could be. They passed through long stretches of empty country, seeing nothing but jackrabbits and the occasional hawk circling overhead. Old Hat rode with the easy posture of a man who'd spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it. He didn't think much about where he was going or what he'd do when he got there. That was the thing about drifting, you just moved forward, day by day, letting the road decide your destination. But the road, as it turned out, had other plans. Around mid-morning, they came upon the old railroad trestle. It was a relic from 15 years back when some ambitious company thought they could run a line through this country. They'd gotten as far as building this bridge before running out of money and enthusiasm. Now it stood abandoned, a skeleton of cast iron and rotting wood spanning a dry gulch. Old Hat had passed it a dozen times before and never given it much thought. Today would be different. Scout's ears perked up first, his whole body going tense. The dog stopped dead in his tracks, head swiveling toward the bridge, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Old Hat reined in Copper, instantly alert. Scout didn't spook easy, and when he did, it meant something was wrong. "What is it, boy?" Old Hat's hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his hip, his eyes scanning the area. He saw nothing, just the bridge, the empty land, the endless blue sky. But Scout was fixed on something, his growl deepening. Then, without warning, the dog bolted. "Scout, come back here!" Old Hat called, but the dog was already running full speed toward the bridge, barking with an urgency that made the hair on Old Hat's neck stand up. Something was wrong, very wrong. Old Hat kicked Copper into a gallop, chasing after his dog, his mind already running through possibilities. Snake den? Mountain lion? Another animal in distress? Scout was trained to alert for danger, not to run toward it, which meant whatever he'd sensed wasn't a threat to them, it was something else entirely. As they got closer, Scout's barking changed from alert to frantic, desperate. The dog disappeared beneath the bridge's shadow, and Old Hat could hear him whining, scratching at something. That's when he smelled it, the faint but unmistakable scent of human sweat and fear. Old Hat dismounted fast, tying Copper's reins to a rusted piece of the bridge's support structure. His hand stayed on his revolver as he moved toward Scout's barking, every sense heightened, every instinct honed, from 3 decades of law work screaming that he was walking into something bad. He ducked under the bridge's overhang, his eyes adjusting to the sudden shade. Scout stood about 20 feet in, his tail tucked, his body language all wrong, protective, worried, gentle instead of aggressive. And then Old Hat saw them, 3 small figures huddled against the bridge's stone foundation. Children, 3 young girls, bound hand and foot with heavy rope, black cloth tied over their eyes. They weren't moving much, just small trembling shifts that told him they were still alive, but barely. The oldest one, maybe 14, heard his boots on the gravel and went absolutely rigid. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked from thirst and terror, "please don't hurt us anymore." Old Hat felt his heart drop straight through his chest. In all his years as a ranger, all the terrible things he'd seen, few things hit him as hard as this. Children. Someone had tied up children and left them here to die in the heat. He holstered his revolver and dropped to one knee, his voice coming out soft and gentle. "Easy now, little ones. I'm not here to hurt you. My name's Jebediah Miller, and I'm going to get you out of here." The girl's head turned toward his voice, hope and fear warring in her posture. "Are you real? Or are we—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm real," Old Hat said, his throat tight, "and you're going to be just fine. My dog Scout here found you, and we're going to take care of you." He reached for the blindfold on the oldest girl, but she flinched back hard. "Don't! They said they're watching. They said if anyone tries to free us, they'll shoot. They're out there, in the rocks. They're waiting." Old Hat's blood went cold. His hand froze halfway to the blindfold, and his eyes immediately went to the landscape beyond the bridge. He'd been so focused on the girls, he hadn't done what he always did, check his surroundings, look for threats, assess the tactical situation. That mistake could have cost all of them their lives. He stood slowly, his mind shifting into the old patterns, the ranger instincts taking over. Now he looked at the area with different eyes, seeing what he'd missed before. The disturbed gravel on the hillside, the glint of metal in the rocks to the north, the way the brush had been trampled in a half-circle around the bridge, creating concealed positions. This wasn't a rescue site, it was a killing ground, and he'd walked right into the center of it. Old Hat's jaw clenched as he forced himself to remain still, to not make any sudden movements that might trigger whoever was watching. His hands stayed loose at his sides, but every muscle in his body was coiled, ready. Scout sensed the shift in his demeanor and moved closer to the girls, placing himself between them and the open ground beyond the bridge. "How many?" Old Hat asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The oldest girl tilted her head, listening to his voice. "We're not sure. At least 4, maybe more. They've been there since yesterday morning, we think. Taking turns. Waiting." "When did they take you?" 3 days ago." Her voice cracked. "From our house, in Esperanza. They broke in at night, tied us up, put bags over our heads. We could hear them talking, planning. They brought us here and said." She stopped, swallowing hard. "They said anyone who tried to help us would die, that we were bait." Old Hat's mind raced through the implications. 3 days without proper water or food, tied up in the elements. These girls should have been dead by now, or close to it. The fact they were still conscious meant someone had been giving them just enough to keep them alive, prolonging their suffering, making sure they stayed viable as bait. It was cruel, calculated, and professional. This wasn't random violence. This was a message. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling again but keeping his body angled so he could watch the rocks. Emma Thornton. "These are my sisters, Clara and Beth." Her voice steadied a bit, drawing strength from having someone to talk to. "Our father is Samuel Thornton. He's the magistrate in Esperanza. He's been investigating a gang, the Carranza gang. They smuggle guns, rob stages, hurt people. Papa said he was close to having enough evidence to shut them down. Then they took us." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This was retaliation, a warning. Take the magistrate's children, make them suffer, make their rescue impossible. Show everyone what happens when you stand against the Carranza gang. Old Hat had heard of Vicente Carranza. The name came up in campfire talk, in wanted posters, in the careful conversations men had when they thought no one was listening. The gang operated on both sides of the border, using the chaos of unclear jurisdiction to their advantage. They were brutal, efficient, and utterly without mercy. "Clara, Beth, can you hear me?" Old Hat kept his voice gentle. A small whimper came from the middle child. "I'm Clara. I'm 11. Beth is 8. She hasn't talked since yesterday. I think she's given up." The smallest girl lay curled on her side, her breathing shallow. Even from here, Old Hat could see the sunburn on her exposed arms, the way her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. She needed water, shelter, medical attention. They all did. But if he made a move to free them now, the shooters in the hills would open fire, the girls would be caught in the crossfire, and they'd all likely die. He'd walked into a trap designed to kill would-be rescuers and send a message to anyone else foolish enough to challenge the Carranza gang. And now he had to figure out how to turn that trap around. "Emma, listen to me carefully," Old Hat said, his voice calm despite the storm of anger building in his chest. "I need you to tell me everything you remember about the men who took you. Their voices, their habits, anything that might help. The leader, his name is Vicente. The others called him that. He has an accent, Mexican, but not heavy. He wears silver conchos on his vest. I could hear them jingling when he walked. He's the one who planned this. He's the one watching." Old Hat filed that away. Vicente Carranza himself, not just his men. That meant this was personal for him, important enough to oversee directly. It also meant he'd be the most dangerous one out there, the one least likely to make a mistake. Did they say anything about what they were waiting for? Did they mention anyone specific? Emma hesitated. Vicente said something strange. He told his men to be patient, that the old ranger would come, that he always came. She turned her blindfolded face toward Old Hat. Were you a ranger?" The question hit him like a physical blow. They'd been waiting for him specifically. That made no sense. He'd been retired for a decade, drifting, staying out of everything. How would Vicente Carranza even know he existed, let alone predict he'd be the one to find these girls? Unless someone had told them, unless they'd been tracking him. Old Hat's mind spun through the past few weeks. Had he been followed? Had someone at the ranch talked? He'd been careful not to draw attention, to keep his head down. But maybe that hadn't been enough. Maybe his reputation preceded him in ways he hadn't considered. "I was a ranger," he admitted, "long time ago. Then they were waiting for you." Emma's voice carried a mix of hope and fear. "Does that mean you can save us?" Could he? The tactical situation was about as bad as it got. He was one man with a revolver and a rifle against at least 4 hidden shooters with prepared positions and clear fields of fire. They had patience and position. He had what? An old dog and 3 terrified children who couldn't even run if shooting started. But he also had something they didn't expect. He had 30 years of experience outsmarting men who thought they had him beat. He'd survived ambushes, turned traps around, won fights that should have been impossible. The difference between a good lawman and a dead one often came down to willingness to do what the enemy didn't anticipate. "I'm going to get you out of here," he said, and meant it. "But I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" "Yes," Emma said immediately. Clara whimpered agreement. Beth didn't respond at all. Old Hat reached for his canteen, moving slowly and deliberately. He brought it to Emma's lips first. Small sips. Don't gulp. She drank like it was the finest thing she'd ever tasted, water trickling down her chin. He gave her 3 small swallows, then moved to Clara, then Beth. The youngest barely responded when the water touched her lips, but she did swallow reflexively. It was something. As he gave them water, his mind worked the problem. The shooters would be watching for him to cut the ropes, to make a run for it with the girls. They'd be ready for that. They'd expect panic, desperation, the typical response of someone stumbling into this situation, so he couldn't do the expected thing. His eyes went to the saddlebag on copper, still tied to the bridge support 20 feet away. Inside that bag was 3 months' wages in gold dust. Everything he owned, his entire winter stake. An idea formed, cold and calculated and utterly insane. "Emma, I need you and your sisters to do something for me, and it's going to be hard. When I tell you, I need you all to go completely limp, dead weight. Don't move, don't react, no matter what happens. Can you do that?" "Why?" "Because I'm going to make Vicente think he's won. I'm going to give him something he wants more than revenge." Old Hat's voice was steady, but his heart hammered in his chest. "I'm going to give him gold." He stood, making no sudden moves, and walked back to Copper. His hands were steady as he untied the saddlebag, feeling the reassuring weight of the gold pouch inside. This was crazy. This was everything he had. But what good was gold if he couldn't look himself in the mirror after walking away from 3 dying children? Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "A man's wealth is in his character, not his purse." "All right then," he whispered to himself. "Let's see how greedy these boys really are." He pulled the gold pouch from the saddlebag, making sure the movement was visible from the rocks. The leather was darkened with age, but the weight of it was unmistakable. He'd seen men kill for a fraction of what this bag contained. Old Hat walked back under the bridge, speaking loudly now, making sure his voice carried. "Don't you worry, girls. I'm going to get you free. Just need to set my things down first." He placed the gold pouch in the open ground about 15 feet from the girls, far enough that retrieving it would require leaving cover, close enough that it would be clearly visible to anyone watching. Then he pulled his revolver and checked it with deliberate, visible movements. 6 rounds loaded. He'd need every one. Scout understood something was about to happen. The dog's body language changed, muscles tensing, eyes fixed on Old Hat, waiting for the signal they'd practiced 100 times. "Remember, girls," Old Hat whispered. "Stay completely still, no matter what." He positioned himself behind the bridge's stone foundation, using it for cover while keeping the gold pouch in his peripheral vision. His breathing slowed. His mind cleared. Everything else fell away except the moment, the shot, the opportunity he was about to create. In the rocks above, someone shifted position. Metal glinted in the sunlight. They'd seen the gold. Now he just had to wait for greed to overcome discipline. In his experience, it never took long. The waiting was always the hardest part. Old Hat had learned that truth during his first year as a ranger, crouched behind a water trough while 3 bank robbers decided whether to surrender or fight. Time stretched and compressed in strange ways when violence hung in the balance, each second both endless and impossibly brief. He counted his breaths, keeping them slow and even. One of the first things they taught young rangers was breath-controlled panic made you sloppy, made you miss shots you should have made you dead. So you breathed, and you waited, and you trusted your training. Scout lay flat against the ground beside him, absolutely still except for his eyes, which tracked every movement in the rocks above. The dog had been through enough scrapes to know when stealth mattered. He wouldn't move until given the signal, wouldn't bark, wouldn't give away their position. That discipline had saved both their lives more than once. Emma and her sisters had gone quiet, following his instructions. He could hear their shallow breathing, quick and frightened, but they were holding themselves still. Good girls, brave girls. They reminded him of Sarah, in that way scared but resolute, facing the darkness without breaking. The gold pouch sat in that patch of sunlight like a promise, or a curse, depending on how you looked at it. Old Hat tried not to think about what that bag represented: security, comfort, the buffer between him and a hard winter. If he survived the next few minutes, he'd be broke, starting over with nothing but his horse, his dog, and his guns. But he'd also be able to live with himself, and in the end, that was worth more than any amount of gold. Movement in the rocks. Subtle, but there. A shadow shifted about 40 yards out, north side of the bridge. Someone was repositioning, trying to get a better angle on the gold without exposing themselves too much. Old Hat marked the position in his mind, adding it to the mental map he'd been building. 4 shooters, maybe 5. The one who'd just moved was young. Old Hat could tell by the impatience of it, the way he'd shifted too quickly, created too much disturbance. An experienced man would have taken twice as long, moved half as much. That was good. Young meant stupid, and stupid meant predictable. Another movement, west side this time. This one was more careful, but Old Hat caught it anyway. Years of tracking had taught him to see the things most people missed, the way birds went quiet when something moved through their territory, the way light reflected off metal or glass. The small disturbances in the natural pattern of things, too visible now. 2 more he couldn't see but knew were there, probably on the east and south approaches, creating a killing box with the bridge at the center. Classic ambush formation. Anyone who came to help the girls would be caught in crossfire from multiple angles, cut down before they could react. The only problem with that setup was it required discipline. Required the shooters to stay in position, to wait for the signal, to not break formation for any reason. But gold had a way of making men forget discipline. Old Hat's hand rested on the grip of his Navy Colt, fingers loose but ready. The gun was old, older than some of the outlaws watching him, but it had never let him down. He knew its weight, its balance, its tendency to pull slightly left after the 3rd shot. He'd compensated for that pull so many times it was second nature now, programmed into his muscle memory like breathing. The Henry rifle would have given him better range, but it was still in the saddle's scabbard on copper, and moving to get it would break the illusion he was trying to create. He needed Vicente and his men to think he was distracted, focused on the girls, unaware of the danger. The moment they realized he knew about them, the game changed. The gold trick would only work if they thought they were taking advantage of a careless old man. So he played the part, moved like someone whose mind was on rescue, not tactics, kept his body language open, vulnerable, made himself a target. The sun climbed higher, heat building in the rocks, creating mirages in the distance. Old Hat's mouth was dry, but he didn't reach for his canteen. Didn't want to tie up his hands with anything except the gun when the moment came. Scout's ear twitched. Someone was moving on the east side now, the position Old Hat hadn't been able to visually confirm. The dog's hearing was sharper than his, could pick up sounds the human ear missed. That twitch told him everything he needed to know. The net was tightening, the shooters coordinating. They were getting ready to make their move. "Mister?" Emma's whisper was so quiet he almost missed it. "Are they coming?" "Soon," he breathed back. "Remember what I told you. No matter what happens, stay down. What if they shoot you?" It was a fair question, asked with the blunt honesty of someone too scared to worry about politeness. If he went down, the girls would be trapped again, waiting for the next rescuer, if one ever came. The odds of that happening before they died of exposure were slim. "Then Scout will protect you until help comes," Old Hat said, meaning it. The dog would die defending these children if it came to that. It was the kind of loyalty that couldn't be trained, only earned. "But I don't plan on getting shot today." Clara made a small sound, something between a sob and a laugh. The absurdity of the statement, this old man casually discussing his survival while surrounded by killers, must have struck her as either brave or insane. Maybe both. Beth still hadn't made a sound. Old Hat worried about her most. The little one had retreated somewhere deep inside herself, to a place where the fear couldn't reach. He'd seen that before, in war, in victims of terrible violence. Sometimes people came back from that place, sometimes they didn't. All the more reason to make sure they got out of here alive. The shadow on the north side moved again, less cautious this time. Old Hat caught the glint of sunlight on a gun barrel, saw the outline of a man rising from behind a boulder, young, like he'd thought. Maybe 20, with the kind of swagger that came from never having been truly tested. The man's eyes were locked on the gold pouch. Old Hat's finger brushed the trigger of his revolver, ready but not yet committed. One more. He needed at least one more to break cover before he acted. Take down 2 in the first seconds. Scout could handle a third, and that would leave 1 or 2 for him to deal with while getting the girls to safety. A voice called out from the rocks, rough and heavily accented, "Rodrigo, wait for the signal." But Rodrigo wasn't waiting. The young outlaw's greed had outpaced his common sense, and he was already moving down the hillside, his boots sliding on loose gravel, his rifle held carelessly in one hand, while his other reached for the gold pouch. From the west side, another man emerged, older, with a scarred face and missing 2 fingers on his left hand. He saw Rodrigo breaking formation and cursed in Spanish, but the damage was done. If one man broke, others would follow. No one wanted to be the fool who let someone else claim the prize. The scarred man started down the hill too, moving faster, trying to beat Rodrigo to the gold. Old Hat's hand tightened on his revolver. Scout's muscles coiled like springs. The girls held their breath. And Vicente Carranza, watching from somewhere in those rocks, realized too late that his ambush had just turned into a disaster. Old Hat gave Scout the signal, a barely perceptible flick of his wrist. The German shepherd exploded into motion, a blur of black and tan fur launching across the open ground toward the scarred outlaw on the west side. The man didn't even have time to bring his rifle up before 90 pounds of trained attack dog hit him like a freight train, jaws clamping onto his gun arm, dragging him down. In the same instant, Old Hat rose from behind cover, his navy colt coming up smooth and natural as water flowing downhill. The young outlaw Rodrigo spun toward him, eyes wide with sudden understanding, rifle swinging around. Too slow. Old Hat's first shot took Rodrigo in the shoulder, spinning him like a top. The rifle flew from his hands, clattering on the rocks. The young man went down hard, crying out in pain and shock. Gunfire erupted from the rocks as the remaining outlaws opened up, bullets ricocheting off the bridge's iron supports, kicking up dust and gravel. Old Hat was already moving, staying low, using the bridge's structure for cover, while his mind tracked the shooter positions by muzzle flash. East side, behind the cluster of boulders. South side, in the brush, near the dried creek bed. And one more, higher up on the north side, probably Vicente himself, with the best overview of the situation. 3 left. Scout had 1 occupied. That left 2 for him to handle before they could regroup. The shooter in the east made his mistake by firing 3 times in rapid succession, anger shooting, not aimed shooting. Old Hat tracked the muzzle flashes, marked the position precisely, and waited for the inevitable pause while the man reloaded or repositioned. The pause came. 2 seconds of silence. Old Hat moved. He came around the bridge support at an angle that put the stone foundation between him and the south shooter, while giving him a clear line to the east. The outlaw was exactly where Old Hat expected, partially exposed behind a boulder, fumbling with his rifle, head down. Old Hat's second shot caught the man in the leg, just above the knee. Not a killing shot, but enough to take the fight out of him. The outlaw screamed and dropped, his rifle forgotten as he clutched his shattered limb. 2 down, properly. 3 if you counted the one Scout had pinned, which Old Hat did. The scarred man's screams had taken on a desperate quality. Scout wasn't killing him, but he wasn't letting go either. Those powerful jaws locked on the man's forearm, keeping him grounded and neutralized. That left the south shooter and Vicente. Bullets chewed into the bridge support near Old Hat's head, forcing him back into cover. The south shooter had discipline. He wasn't panic-firing like his friend had been. Each shot was measured, placed, designed to keep Old Hat pinned, while the shooter repositioned for a better angle. Old Hat respected that, respected it enough to take it seriously. He dropped flat and rolled left, coming up behind a different section of bridge support, giving himself a new angle. The movement drew fire, but the bullets hit where he'd been, not where he was. He caught a glimpse of the south shooter, middle-aged, weathered, moving through the brush with the confidence of experience. This one had been a soldier once, or maybe a lawman gone bad. Either way, he knew what he was doing, and that made him dangerous. Old Hat's third shot was aimed at movement, not man. He put a round into the brush 2 feet ahead of where he'd seen the shooter, anticipating the path. The bullet must have come close because the movement stopped abruptly, followed by a string of creative cursing in 2 languages. "Give it up," Old Hat called out, his voice carrying across the killing ground. "You're outmaneuvered and outgunned. Throw down your weapons and you'll live to see trial." The response was another bullet, this one from Vicente's position on the high ground. It hit 6 inches from Old Hat's head, spraying rock fragments that stung his cheek. Close. Too close. Vicente was a better shot than his men, and he had the superior position. Old Hat needed to change the equation. "Scout, break!" The German shepherd released the scarred outlaw immediately, leaving him writhing on the ground, and sprinted back toward Old Hat. The dog moved like mercury, fluid and fast, zigzagging to make himself a harder target. Bullets kicked up dust in his wake, but none found their mark. Scout reached cover and pressed against Old Hat's leg, panting but unharmed. Good boy. Best damned dog a man could ask for. "Watch the girls," Old Hat commanded, and Scout immediately moved to where Emma and her sisters lay trembling. The dog positioned himself between them and the remaining shooters, ready to defend. Old Hat reloaded his Navy Colt with practiced efficiency. He'd done this so many times he could do it blind. Open the loading gate, rotate the cylinder, tap out the spent brass, slide in fresh rounds, close the gate, 10 seconds from empty to full, and his eyes never left the battlefield. The south shooter made his next move, breaking from the brush and sprinting toward better cover. Bold, but predictable. Old Hat had been waiting for exactly that kind of desperation. He tracked the running man, led him by 2 body lengths, and squeezed the trigger. The 4th shot hit the outlaw in the side, not deep enough to kill, but enough to fold him in half. The man hit the ground hard and stayed down, gasping and clutching his ribs. 3 down for certain now. 4, if you counted the one Scout had mauled, who was currently trying to crawl away while cradling his mangled arm. That left Vicente Carranza. "You're alone now, Vicente," Old Hat called. "Your men are down. There's no profit in dying today." "You're the one who's going to die, old man." Vicente's voice came from the high rocks, venomous with rage. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what you've done?" "I know you kidnap children," Old Hat replied, his voice cold. "I know you leave them to die in the sun. That's all I need to know. You killed my brother." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning Old Hat didn't yet understand. Killed his brother? He'd killed a lot of men in his ranger days, most of them deserving it. But which one had been Vicente's brother? If he died by my hand, he died for breaking the law, Old Hat said. "Same as you will. if you keep this up. Mateo Carranza. 15 years ago, you led the raid on our ranch. You shot him down like a dog. Memory clicked into place. The Carranza ranch raid. Old Hat had been 30 years younger then, leading a squad of rangers after a gang smuggling stolen army rifles across the border. They'd hit the ranch at dawn, caught most of the gang sleeping, but one man, Mateo, had come out fighting, rifle blazing, determined to take someone with him. Old Hat had been faster. A single shot, center mass, dropping Mateo where he stood. There'd been a boy there too. Old Hat remembered now. Maybe 13 or 14, watching from the barn door, screaming as his brother fell. The rangers had arrested him along with the others, but he'd been released a year later due to his age. No evidence he'd been directly involved in the smuggling. That boy had been Vicente. Your brother made his choice, Old Hat said, though his voice had softened slightly. He chose the outlaw life, and it caught up with him. That's the way of things. And you, Vicente's voice cracked with emotion, you walked away. You got to live your life while Mateo rotted in the ground, while I rotted in prison. Do you know what they do to boys in those places? Old Hat did know. It wasn't pretty. The territorial prisons were brutal, lawless places where the strong preyed on the weak. A 14-year-old kid wouldn't have stood a chance. I'm sorry for what happened to you, Old Hat said, and meant it. But those girls down here, they're innocent. They didn't do anything to you or your brother. Let me take them home, and we can settle this between us, man to man. You think I care about the girls? Vicente laughed, bitter and broken. They're bait, old man, just like I knew you'd come. The great Jebediah Miller, the ranger who couldn't walk away from people in trouble. I've been tracking you for 6 months, waiting for the right moment. And here you are. 6 months. Vicente had been planning this for 6 months, studying Old Hat's patterns, learning his roots, waiting for an opportunity to exact revenge. The dedication was almost impressive in its obsession. Then you've got what you wanted, Old Hat said. I'm here. Let the girls go and face me proper. Let them go. Vicente's voice dripped with contempt. Why would I do that? I want you to die knowing you failed them. Want you to die knowing you're not the hero you think you are. A bullet struck near Old Hat's position, then another, Vicente laying down fire while he repositioned. The man was moving, working his way around for a better angle. Smart. The high ground was good for overview, but limited his shot opportunities. Old Hat had 2 rounds left in the Colt. He could retrieve the Henry rifle from Copper, but that would mean leaving cover, exposing himself. The tactical situation was in his favor. Vicente's men were neutralized. The element of surprise was long gone, and time was on Old Hat's side. Eventually, Vicente would have to make a move or retreat. But eventually wasn't good enough. The girls needed medical attention. Beth especially. Every minute they stayed in this heat was a minute closer to permanent damage or death. Old Hat made his decision. Sometimes the only way out was through. Scout, stay with the girls, he commanded. Then, louder, Vicente, I'm coming up. And before the outlaw leader could respond, Old Hat was moving, sprinting from cover toward the rocks where Vicente had been firing from, his Navy Colt ready, his mind clear, his purpose absolute. Behind him, Emma's voice called out, terrified, "No, don't leave us." But he was already committed, already halfway across the killing ground, bullets kicking up dust at his heels, his boots pounding on hard earth, his heart hammering, but his aim steady. This ended now. Vicente's shot went wide, panic throwing off his aim. Old Hat dove behind a boulder 10 yards from Vicente's position, hitting the ground hard, but rolling with it, coming up already sighting down his revolver. He caught a glimpse of Vicente scrambling up the rocks, heading for higher ground, and fired his 5th shot. The bullet sparked off stone inches from Vicente's boot, forcing him to stumble. The man recovered quickly, bringing his rifle around, but Old Hat was already moving again, closing the distance, making himself a harder target. Vicente fired wild, the crack of his rifle echoing off the hills, but the shot went high. Old Hat's last bullet took Vicente in the shoulder, the same shoulder the outlaw leader had exposed when he'd turned to run. The impact spun him around, and his rifle clattered down the rocks. Vicente collapsed, clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in pain and fury. "Finish it," he spat. "Go ahead, killer. Finish what you started 15 years ago." Old Hat stood over him, breathing hard but steady, his empty revolver still trained on Vicente's. "I'm not going to kill you. You're going to stand trial for what you did to those girls. You think I'll make it to trial?" Vicente laughed, blood seeping between his fingers. "You think my men will let me rot in jail?" "Your men are done," Old Hat said flatly. "It's over, Vicente. The vendetta, the gang, all of it. Over." He reached down and hauled Vicente to his feet with one hand, ignoring the man's grunt of pain. With quick, efficient movements, he bound Vicente's hands behind his back using the outlaw's own belt, then did the same for his feet. Vicente would live, but he wouldn't be going anywhere. Old Hat retrieved Vicente's rifle and tossed it far down the hillside, then made his way back to where the other outlaws lay wounded. The young one, Rodrigo, was crying, cradling his shattered shoulder. The one Scout had mauled was unconscious from pain and blood loss. The leg-shot outlaw had passed out. The one Old Hat had hit in the ribs was still conscious, glaring with impotent rage. He bound them all, working quickly but carefully. Even wounded and defeated, desperate men could be dangerous. He wasn't taking chances. By the time he made it back to the bridge, his hands were shaking from adrenaline crash. The fight was over, the threat was neutralized, and somehow, miraculously, he was still alive. Scout was exactly where Old Hat had left him, standing guard over the three sisters. The dog's tail started wagging when he saw Old Hat approach, but he didn't leave his post until given permission. "Good boy," Old Hat said, his voice rough. "Best damn dog in the world." He knelt beside Emma and gently removed her blindfold. She blinked in the sudden light, her eyes red and swollen from crying and sun exposure. When she focused on his face, she burst into fresh tears. "You came back," she sobbed. "You came back." "Of course I did," Old Hat said softly, cutting the ropes binding her wrists and ankles. The hemp had rubbed her skin raw, leaving angry welts. "I promised, didn't I?" He moved to Clara next, removing her blindfold with the same gentleness. The 11-year-old stared at him like he was something from a dream, her lips moving but no sound coming out. When he freed her hands, she threw her arms around his neck and held on like she'd never let go. He murmured, patting her back awkwardly. "You're safe now. You're all safe." Beth was last, and she worried him most. When he removed her blindfold, her eyes didn't track properly, glazed and distant. She was conscious but not present, her mind having retreated to some place beyond the reach of terror and pain. Old Hat gathered her small body into his arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile. She didn't resist, didn't respond at all, just lay limp against his chest. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse thready. She needed a doctor, and soon. "Can you girls ride?" he asked Emma and Clara. Emma nodded, though she looked unsteady. Clara just clung to his arm, unable or unwilling to let go. "All right then. We're going to Esperanza. Your father is there, and he's been worried sick about you." Old Hat kept his voice calm, reassuring. "It's about 2 hours' ride. Think you can make it? Together?" Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. "We can stay together?" "Every step of the way," Old Hat promised. He retrieved his gold pouch from where it still lay in the dirt, untouched after all. The leather was warm from the sun, the weight familiar in his hand. He'd gambled everything on his plan, working, and somehow it had. His winter stake was secure. But looking at the 3 girls traumatized, injured, but alive, he knew he'd have made the same choice, even if the pouch had been taken. Some things mattered more than gold. Getting everyone organized took time. Old Hat fashioned a makeshift sling from his bedroll and secured Beth against his chest, keeping both hands free for the reins. Emma, though weak, insisted she could ride behind him. Clara, still clinging to any adult presence, rode with Scout walking protectively beside Copper. Before they left, Old Hat secured the wounded outlaws to the bridge supports with lengths of rope. They weren't going anywhere. And when he sent word from Esperanza, the marshal could send men to collect them. Vicente watched all this with hate-filled eyes. "This isn't over," he rasped. "When I get out—" "You won't," Old Hat said flatly. "Kidnapping a magistrate's daughters, child endangerment, attempted murder. You'll hang, Vicente. The vendetta dies here." He didn't wait for a response, just mounted Copper and urged the horse into a gentle walk. The girls needed care, not conversation with the man who'd tormented them. The ride to Esperanza felt longer than 2 hours. Beth remained unconscious against his chest, her breathing so faint he kept checking to make sure she was still alive. Emma held onto him tightly, occasionally whimpering when a jolt sent pain through her abraded wrists. Clara walked beside them in silence, one hand on Scout's collar, taking comfort from the dog's steady presence. Old Hat talked to them as they rode, keeping his voice low and soothing. He told them about Sarah, about how she'd loved wildflowers and could name every plant that grew in Texas. He told them about his years as a ranger, carefully editing out the violence and focusing on the places he'd seen, the decent people he'd met. He told them about Scout, about finding him half-starved on a trail and how the dog had chosen to stay. The girls didn't say much in response, but he could feel them listening, anchoring themselves to his words, using his stories to pull themselves back from the edge of trauma. Emma eventually found her voice. "Will Papa be angry?" The question surprised him. "Angry? Why would he be angry? We let them take us. We didn't fight hard enough. If we'd been stronger—" "Stop right there," Old Hat interrupted gently but firmly. "You girls did. Nothing wrong. Nothing. You hear me? 3 armed men broke into your house in the night. There was nothing you could have done to stop them. Your father's going to be so grateful to have you back, he won't care about anything else." "But we've been gone 3 days," Clara whispered. "What if he thinks we're ruined?" Old Hat's heart broke a little at that. These girls, brutalized and terrorized, were worried about shame and blame, instead of understanding they were the victims. That was what people like Vicente did. They didn't just hurt bodies, they poisoned minds. "Your father is going to hold you and cry," Old Hat said with absolute certainty. "He's going to thank God you're alive. And then he's going to make sure you're taken care of, safe, and loved. That's what good fathers do. Trust me on this." Emma's grip on him loosened slightly, some of the tension draining from her small body. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for coming back, for saving us. Any decent man would have done the same, but you're the one who did it." Emma's voice was fierce despite its weakness. "You're the one who was there." Old Hat didn't have an answer for that. Sometimes being in the right place at the right time was just luck, or fate. Or maybe God's hand moving pieces around on a board only he could see. They crested a rise, and Esperanza spread out before them in the valley below. Esperanza was a modest frontier town, the kind that sprung up wherever people decided to make a stand against the wilderness and try to carve out something resembling civilization. Wooden buildings lined a dusty main street, their false fronts painted in fading colors. A church steeple rose at the far end, white paint peeling in the relentless sun. Signs advertised a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and the marshal's office. As they descended the hill, a boy playing in the street spotted them. His eyes went wide, and he took off running, shouting something Old Hat couldn't quite make out. Within moments, people began emerging from buildings, shading their eyes against the afternoon sun, pointing and talking amongst themselves. By the time Old Hat reached the main street, a small crowd had gathered. He saw confusion on their faces, then recognition, then shock as they realized who the girls were. A woman, in an apron, gasped, "Lord above, it's the Thornton girls." "Someone fetch the magistrate," an older man shouted. "Fetch Samuel." Now, a door banged open, and a man came running from a building marked with a wooden sign, "Magistrate's Office." Samuel Thornton was in his mid-50s, grey-haired and lean, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life trying to bring order to a place that resisted it. He wore spectacles that caught the sunlight as he ran, and his face was drawn with the kind of exhaustion that came from 3 days of helpless terror. When he saw the girls, he stumbled, catching himself against a hitching post. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. For a moment, he just stood there, staring like he was seeing ghosts. Then he was running again, reaching up as Old Hat dismounted, with Beth still cradled against his chest. Thornton's hands shook as he touched his youngest daughter's face, checking for life, for warmth, for any sign this wasn't a cruel dream. "She's alive," Old Hat said quietly. "They all are, but they need care, Beth especially. She's gone somewhere inside herself." Thornton took Beth from him with infinite gentleness, tears streaming down his face. The tough magistrate who'd stood up to the Carranza gang, who'd built a reputation for unflinching justice, broke down completely as he held his little girl. Emma and Clara slid off the horse, their legs barely supporting them. Thornton knelt, gathering all 3 daughters into his arms, sobbing openly. The girls clung to their father, crying too, months of held-in fear and pain, finally finding release. The crowd watched in respectful silence. Even the hardest men in Esperanza, the ones who'd seen violence and death and thought themselves immune to sentiment, looked away or cleared their throats roughly. There was something sacred about witnessing a father reunited with his children, something that transcended the usual divisions of frontier life. Old Hat stepped back, giving them space. Scout pressed against his leg, and he rested a hand on the dog's head, suddenly aware of how tired he was. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving behind the deep ache of a 68-year-old body that had just survived a gunfight it had no business winning. Thornton finally looked up, his face wet with tears. "Who are you? How did you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Name's Jebediah Miller," Old Hat said. "Found them under the old trestle bridge. The Carranza gang had them tied up as bait. Vicente and his men are still there, wounded and bound. You'll want to send someone to collect them." "Vicente Carranza?" The town marshal stepped forward, a solid man in his 40s with a badge pinned to his vest. "You took down Vicente Carranza?" "Him and 4 others," Old Hat confirmed. "They're not going anywhere." The marshal looked at him with new respect, clearly reassessing the dusty old man standing before him. "I'll organize a party immediately." He turned to the crowd. "Tom, Jake, Hernandez, get horses and rifles. We're riding out to make arrests." As men scattered to gather supplies, Thornton stood with his daughters, unwilling to let them go, even as a matronly woman approached with offers of medical care. "My house," he said hoarsely. "Please, bring them to my house. Dr. Cartwright is there, waiting." His voice broke again. He'd had a doctor standing by, hoping against hope that his girls would come home. The forward planning of a man who'd refused to give up, even when logic said he should. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Thornton's house was modest but comfortable, with evidence of feminine touches everywhere. Embroidered curtains, pressed flowers in frames, a well-tended garden out front. The late Mrs. Thornton's presence lingered in every detail, maintained by her daughters in her memory. Dr. Cartwright, a white-haired man with gentle hands, examined each girl thoroughly. Emma had severe dehydration, rope burns, and sun exposure, but would recover fully with rest and care. Clara was in similar condition, though her emotional state was more fragile. Beth was the concern her body was failing, shutting down from trauma and exposure. The doctor worked quickly, administering fluids, treating her burns, trying to coax her back from wherever her mind had fled. Old Hat sat on the front porch, Scout beside him, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. People kept approaching, offering thanks, asking questions, trying to press rewards into his hands. He declined everything, redirecting their gratitude toward the girls who'd survived, toward Thornton who'd never stopped looking. Eventually, Thornton himself came out, 2 glasses of water in hand. He offered one to Old Hat and sat down heavily in the other porch chair. For a long moment, they just sat in silence, drinking their water, watching the town settle into evening. It was a comfortable quiet, the kind that exists between men who've both seen darkness and understand what it costs to stand against it. Emma told me everything, Thornton finally said. About the trap, about the gold you used as bait, about how you risked your life for 3 children you'd never met. Had to be done, Old Hat said simply. But it didn't have to be you. Thornton turned to look at him. You could have ridden past. Most men would have. Hell, most men wouldn't have even gotten off their horse. But you saw my girls, and you decided their lives were worth more than your own safety, worth more than your fortune. Old Hat shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. A man does what's right, nothing more to it than that. There's everything more to it. Thornton's voice was fierce. You gave me back my world. Without my girls. He stopped, unable to continue. Old Hat understood. He'd lost Sarah and knew that particular emptiness, that sense that the center had fallen out of your life and nothing could ever be right again. Thornton had faced that same abyss for 3 days, staring into it, wondering if he'd ever see his daughters alive again. How did you even find them? Thornton asked. The gang chose that bridge specifically because it's off the main trails. No one should have been there. Scout found them. Old Hat nodded toward the dog. He's got instincts I've learned to trust, bolted toward the bridge like his tail was on fire, and I followed. Thornton looked at the German shepherd with something close to reverence. Then, I owe your dog my daughter's lives as much as I owe you. He'll accept payment in bacon, Old Hat said deadpan. It was a weak joke, but Thornton laughed. Anyway, the sound startling them both. It had probably been days since the magistrate had laughed, and the release seemed to crack something open in him. He laughed harder, wiping his eyes, and Old Hat found himself smiling too. Bacon it is, Thornton said, sobering. And for you, whatever you need. Room and board, money, a job, name it, and it's yours. This town owes you a debt we can never repay. I don't need payment for doing the right thing. I know you don't. That's exactly why you deserve it. Thornton stood, extending his hand. At least stay for dinner. Let me feed you properly. Let my girls thank you when they're feeling better. You've given me back my family. Let me share that gift with you, at least for one evening. Old Hat looked at the offered hand, then at the warm light spilling from the house windows, then at Scout, who was already eyeing the door hopefully. He thought about his usual evening cold camp, hardtack and beans, sleeping on hard ground under endless stars. It wasn't a bad life, but it was a lonely one. And maybe, just for tonight, he didn't have to be quite so alone. He shook Thornton's hand. Dinner sounds fine, but then I'll be moving on. I'm not one for staying in place too long. Fair enough, Thornton said, though his eyes suggested he hoped to change Old Hat's mind. One night at a time. They went inside together, Scout trailing behind, and for the first time in 10 years, Jebediah Miller sat at a family table. Dinner was a quiet affair, though not uncomfortable. The girls ate upstairs in their rooms, still too shaken to face company, but Dr. Cartwright joined them at the table, along with the town marshal, whose name was Benjamin Wade. The conversation stayed light weather, cattle prices, the quality of this year's harvest. No one wanted to discuss what had happened. Not yet. The wounds were too fresh. But after the meal, when coffee was poured and the doctor had excused himself to check on Beth one more time, Thornton's expression grew serious. He disappeared into his study and returned carrying a wooden box, worn and scarred from years of use. I need to show you something, he said, setting the box on the table. I've been building this case against the Carranza gang for 8 months. It's the most complete documentation of criminal activity I've ever assembled. He opened the box, revealing stacks of papers, witness statements, bills of sale for stolen goods, maps showing smuggling routes, and most damning of all, a ledger detailing payments made to corrupt officials on both sides of the border. This would hang them all, Marshal Wade said quietly, leafing through some of the documents. This is enough to break their entire operation. That's why they took my girls, Thornton said, his voice tight. 3 weeks ago, word got out that I was close to finishing the investigation. Someone in my office talked, or maybe someone saw me meeting with witnesses. However it happened, Vicente Carranza found out. He sent me a message, Destroy the evidence and resign, or my daughters would pay the price. But you didn't, Old Hat observed. I didn't. Thornton's jaw clenched. Not because I'm brave, or because I value justice over family. God forgive me, I would have burned every page if it meant keeping them safe. But Vicente never gave me the chance to comply. He took them before his messenger even delivered the demands. I think, he paused, choosing his words carefully, I think taking them was always the real goal. The rest was just window dressing. Marshal Wade frowned. That doesn't make sense. Why take hostages if you don't give their father a chance to meet your demands? Because it wasn't about stopping my investigation, Thornton said. He pulled out a wanted poster from the bottom of the box and slid it across the table to Old Hat. It was about this. Old Hat looked down at the poster and felt ice water pour through his veins. The face staring back at him was younger than the man he'd fought today, unlined and fierce, but unmistakably Vicente Carranza. The name below the image included a detail that made everything click into horrible place. Vicente Mateo Carranza, brother of deceased outlaw Mateo Santiago Carranza. Mateo Carranza, Old Hat said slowly. 15 years ago, the rifle smuggling operation. Thornton nodded grimly. I did some digging after Vicente's men first approached me. Mateo was running stolen army rifles across the border, selling them to revolutionaries and bandits. The Rangers hit his operation hard, killed Mateo, and arrested most of his gang, including his teenage brother Vicente. Old Hat remembered it clearly now. That raid had been one of his most successful operations as a Ranger captain. They'd recovered nearly 200 stolen rifles, prevented them from reaching hostile hands, and broken up a smuggling network that had been operating for years. It had been a clean operation, by the book, justified in every way. But to a 14-year-old boy watching his brother die, none of that mattered. The raid was led by Ranger Captain Jebediah Miller. Thornton continued quietly, watching Old Hat's face. Vicente spent a year in a territorial prison, then got released due to his age. But he didn't forget. He spent the next 14 years building his own gang, establishing his power, waiting for the right moment. Waiting for me, Old Hat said, the pieces falling into place like a puzzle made of guilt and regret. He's been tracking you, Marshal Wade confirmed. We found notes in one of his hideouts. He's been following your movements for months, knew your habits, your roots, your tendency to help people in trouble. The kidnapping of my girls, the location he chose, the timing, it was all designed to draw you in. Old Hat felt something cold settle in his chest. Those 3 girls, traumatized and left to die in the heat, had been bait, not for their father, but for him. Vicente's entire plan had been built around the idea that a retired ranger wouldn't be able to walk past children in danger. And he'd been right. My daughters nearly died because of a 15-year-old vendetta against you, Thornton said. There was no accusation in his voice, just weary statement of fact. Vicente wanted you to find them, wanted you to try to rescue them. He was planning to kill you in front of them, make them watch, then kill them too. A perfect revenge, destroying you and hurting me in the process. I'm sorry, Old Hat said, the words inadequate but necessary. I'm sorry I brought this on your family. No, Thornton's voice was sharp. Don't you dare apologize for doing your job 15 years ago or for saving my girls today. Vicente Carranza chose the outlaw life, same as his brother. They chose to steal and kill and terrorize. You were just the lawman who stopped them. But your daughters are alive because of you, Thornton interrupted firmly. Yes, Vicente used them to get to you, but you're the one who outsmarted him. You're the one who turned his trap around. My girls are upstairs, safe and recovering, because you refused to let evil win. I won't hear another word of apology. Old Hat looked at the wanted poster again, at Vicente's young, angry face. How much hatred did it take to plan something like this? To spend 14 years building an empire of crime just to exact revenge on one man? To be willing to torture innocent children just to hurt someone who'd done his duty? There's something else, Marshal Wade said, pulling out another document. While you were bringing the girls back, I went through Vicente's saddlebags. Found this. It was a list of names, written in careful script. Old Hat recognized some of them, former rangers, lawmen he'd worked with, witnesses who testified in major cases. Next to each name was a location and a date. He's been planning more than just revenge against you, Wade explained. He's been systematically targeting everyone involved in that raid 15 years ago. 2 former rangers died last year, one in a riding accident, one from a fall. We thought they were just bad luck. Now I'm wondering if Vicente had a hand in those deaths. Old Hat felt sick. How many people had died or suffered because he'd done his job? How many lives had been twisted by Vicente's obsession? This has to end, he said quietly. Vicente needs to face trial, and his entire operation needs to be dismantled. No more victims. No more innocent people caught in the crossfire. Agreed, Thornton said. With the evidence I've gathered and Vicente in custody, we can break the gang completely. But it won't be easy. He has resources, connections, people who'll try to break him out or eliminate witnesses. Then we make sure he stays locked up, Old Hat said. And we make sure everyone knows the Carranza gang is finished. A sound from upstairs interrupted them, Emma's voice, calling for her. Father, Thornton excused himself quickly, taking the stairs 2 at a time. They could hear his gentle murmuring, Emma's tearful response, then quiet. Marshal Wade refilled their coffee cups. You could have ridden past that bridge, he said conversationally. Plenty of men would have. Hell, if you hadn't had that dog with you, you probably would have missed them entirely. But I didn't ride past, Old Hat said. And Scout did find them. That's what matters. Vicente was counting on that. Counting on you being exactly who you are, a man who can't ignore people in trouble. Wade paused. Doesn't it bother you, being that predictable? Old Hat thought about it, really thought about it. His entire plan had been built on a foundation of manipulation, Vicente using Old Hat's character against him, turning his virtues into weapons. The outlaw had studied him like a hunter studying prey, learning his patterns, exploiting his weaknesses. But those weren't weaknesses. They were choices. No, Old Hat said finally. It doesn't bother me, because if being the kind of man who helps people in trouble makes me predictable, then I'm fine with that. The world needs predictable good more than it needs clever evil. Wade smiled slightly. That's a hell of a philosophy. It's kept me alive this long, Thornton returned, looking more settled. Emma wanted to see you, but I told her you'd still be here in the morning. She needs rest, more than anything. He sat down heavily. They all do. Doctor, Cartwright says Beth is responding to treatment. She squeezed his hand a little while ago. First sign she's coming back to us. That's good, Old Hat said, meaning it. The image of that small, limp body had haunted him since the rescue. It is good. Better than I'd dared hope for. Thornton met his eyes. Mr. Miller, Jebediah, I know you said you'd be moving on, but I want you to reconsider. Esperanza needs someone like you. I need someone like you. Vicente's gang might be broken, but the borderlands are still dangerous. We could use a man with your experience. I'm not a lawman anymore, Old Hat said automatically. Then be something else. A security consultant. A friend. Hell, just be yourself and let people benefit from having you around. Thornton leaned forward. My girls have been through something terrible. They're going to need time to heal, to feel safe again. Emma already trusts you more than she's trusted anyone in days. Having you nearby, even for a little while, would help them recover. Old Hat wanted to say no. Wanted to explain that he didn't stay in one place, didn't put down roots, didn't let himself get attached to people or places. That way led to loss, and he'd had enough loss for one lifetime. But he looked at Thornton's face exhausted, grateful, desperate, and thought about 3 young girls upstairs who'd been through hell because of choices made 15 years ago. Choices he'd made, doing his duty, never imagining the ripples they'd create. Maybe he owed them something, maybe not payment, not debt, but simple human decency. Stay long enough to make sure they felt safe, long enough to know they'd be all right. I'll stay through the trial, he heard himself say. Make sure Vicente answers for what he did. After that, we'll see. Thornton's face lit up with relief and gratitude. That's more than fair. Thank you. Later, as Old Hat bedded down in the spare room Thornton insisted he take, Scout curled up at the foot of the bed. He stared at the ceiling and wondered what Sarah would think of all this. Would she approve of him staying? Or would she remind him that some wounds needed distance to heal? He touched the leather cord where her wedding ring rested against his chest and whispered into the darkness, I hope I'm doing the right thing. Outside, the town of Esperanza settled into peaceful sleep, unaware that the danger was far from over. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange sort of limbo. Vicente and his men were transferred to the territorial prison to await trial, but everyone in Esperanza knew that walls and bars wouldn't necessarily hold them. The Carranza gang had resources, connections, and a long history of getting their people out of tight situations. Old Hat took a room at the boarding house and found himself settling into an unexpected routine. Mornings, he'd help Marshal Wade organize security for the upcoming trial, identifying potential threats and weak points in the town's defenses. Afternoons, he'd check in on the Thornton girls, bringing them little things, a book of poems for Emma, a carved wooden horse for Clara, wildflowers for Beth that reminded him of Sarah's garden. Beth was improving slowly. She'd started talking again, just whispers at first, single words that gradually became sentences. The doctor said it was a good sign that she was finding her way back from wherever trauma had taken her, but she still startled at sudden sounds and refused to be alone after dark. Emma had appointed herself Old Hat's guardian in a way, insisting he join them for supper most evenings, asking him questions about his life, his travels, his years as a ranger. She seemed to need his stories, tales of justice prevailing, of good men standing against evil, of second chances and redemption. He edited them carefully, leaving out the violence and darkness, giving her the hope she needed to heal. Clara had attached herself to Scout with single-minded devotion. The dog, sensing her need, tolerated being dressed in ribbons and having his ears braided with wildflowers. Old Hat would find them in the Thorntons' garden, Clara reading to Scout from storybooks, the dog lying patiently with his head in her lap. It was peaceful, almost domestic, and it scared Old Hat more than any gunfight ever had. The warning came on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the rescue. Marshal Wade burst into the boarding house, his face grim. We've got trouble. Riders coming in. From the south. At least 15, maybe 20. They're flying Carranza colors. Old Hat was dressed and armed in under a minute, his old instincts kicking in. When will they arrive? Hour. Maybe less. They're not trying to hide their approach. Wade's jaw clenched. This is it. They're coming for Vicente, or for revenge, Old Hat said quietly. He thought of Emma, Clara, and Beth, thought of Thornton, who'd already lost so much. We need to evacuate the non-combatants. Already started. Families are moving to the church stone walls, only one entrance, defendable. But Wade hesitated. They're asking for you, the Thornton girls. They won't go unless you promise to protect them. Something in Old Hat's chest tightened. He'd known this was coming, known that staying would mean putting himself between these people and danger. But hearing that 3 traumatized children trusted him enough to base their safety on his presence, that was a weight he hadn't prepared for. I'll protect them, he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Get them to the church. I'll be right behind you. The next hour was controlled chaos. Women and children were herded toward the church, carrying what supplies they could manage. Men gathered weapons, hunting rifles, pistols, shotguns, even a few antique muskets pulled from above fireplaces. Most of them weren't soldiers, just farmers and merchants and craftsmen who'd decided their town was worth defending. Old Hat helped organize them into defensive positions, drawing on 30 years of tactical experience. He posted sharpshooters in second-story windows, created barricades using wagons and barrels, established fallback positions and fields of fire. The men listened to him with the respect born of desperation. He was the man who'd beaten Vicente Carranza, and if anyone could save them, it was him. Thornton refused to evacuate with his daughters. "This is my town," he said simply. "My investigation started this. I won't hide while others fight my battle." Old Hat didn't argue. He understood that kind of duty, that need to stand and be counted when it mattered most. He just made sure Thornton had a good rifle and knew how to use it. The girls were harder. Emma cried when her father told her to go to the church, begging him to come with them. Clara clung to Scout's collar, silent and terrified. Beth had retreated again, her eyes going distant and glassy. "Listen to me, all three of you," Old Hat said, kneeling so he was at their level. He kept his voice gentle but firm. "Your father and I are going to keep you safe, but we need you to be brave one more time. Can you do that? Can you go to the church and wait for us there?" "What if you don't come back?" Emma whispered. "I will come back," Old Hat promised, though he had no way of knowing if he could keep that promise. "I've faced worse odds than this and always come through. This won't be any different. You promise?" He thought about Sarah, about all the times he'd made her that same promise before riding out on ranger business, and how he'd always kept it, right up until the one day when keeping his promise didn't matter anymore because she was gone. "I promise to do everything in my power to come back to you," he said, which was the honest truth. "And I promise that Scout will be there to protect you if anything happens." Emma hugged him fiercely, her thin arms surprisingly strong. Clara did the same, and even Beth reached out to touch his hand, a small gesture of trust that broke his heart. Then they were gone, ushered away by the minister's wife, and Old Hat had to force himself not to watch them go. He had work to do. He found Thornton on the roof of the magistrate's office, looking south toward the horizon. "I can see their dust," the magistrate said quietly. "They're not far now." Old Hat climbed up beside him, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. Sure enough, a dust cloud was rising in the distance, moving steadily toward town. 20 riders, Wade had said, against maybe 30 men in Esperanza, most of whom had never been in a real fight. The odds weren't good, but they rarely were. "You ever killed a man, Samuel?" Old Hat asked. Thornton was quiet for a moment. "Once, 5 years ago. A drunk started shooting up the saloon, killed the bartender. I had to put him down before he killed anyone else. I still see his face sometimes, in dreams. It doesn't get easier." Old Hat said, "Killing, even when it's justified, even when there's no choice, it leaves a mark, but you've done it many times." "I have, and every single one stays with me. I remember their faces, their names when I knew them, the moments before they died." Old Hat touched the leather cord under his shirt, where Sarah's ring rested. "My wife used to worry it would destroy my soul, all that death. I told her I carried it so others wouldn't have to. That was my job, to stand between good people and bad things and accept the cost of doing it." "Is that why you stayed? Because you feel responsible for bringing this on us?" "Partly," Old Hat admitted, "but also because those girls of yours deserve better than to grow up in fear, because you deserve to raise them in peace, because this town deserves a chance to be something other than a battleground for men's pride and revenge." Thornton nodded slowly. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know something. My daughters have laughed more in the past 2 weeks than they did in the 6 months before the kidnapping. Emma told me yesterday that she wants to be brave like you when she grows up. Beth drew a picture of you and Scout protecting them from monsters. You've given them more than their lives back, you've given them hope. Whatever else happens, that matters." Old Hat didn't know what to say to that. He'd never thought of himself as anyone's hero, never wanted to be. He was just a man who tried to do right when right needed doing. But if that had given 3 scared children something to hold on to, some light in their darkness, then maybe Sarah had been right all along. Maybe the marks violence left could be balanced by the good you did with the time between. The sound of hoofbeats reached them. Many horses, moving fast, getting closer. "Here they come," Old Hat said, checking his revolver one more time. 6 rounds loaded, 12 more in his belt. His Henry rifle leaned against the wall, fully loaded, not much. But it would have to be enough. "One thing I don't understand," Thornton said, his voice steady despite the danger approaching. "Why now? Why come in force like this, guns blazing?" They could have tried to break Vicente out quietly, or bribed officials, or any number of sneakier approaches. Why a frontal assault? It was a good question, and Old Hat had been thinking about it himself. The answer, when it came to him, was chilling. "Because Vicente doesn't want to escape," he said slowly. "He wants to send a message, wants to show that no town is safe, no lawman is protected, no one who stands against the Carranza gang survives. This isn't a rescue, it's a massacre." Thornton paled. "The church, the families. That's why we're going to stop them here," Old Hat said firmly. "They want to hit the church, they'll have to go through every man in this town first. And we're going to make sure that's a price they're not willing to pay." The riders crested the final rise and came into view. 23 by Old Hat's count, all heavily armed, led by a man wearing Vicente's distinctive silver conchos, his lieutenant taking command in his absence. They rode straight down the main street, brazen and confident, barely slowing as they entered town. The lead rider raised his hand, and the group spread out, taking positions that would let them control every approach to the magistrate's office and the jail behind it. Marshal Wade stepped into the street, his badge catching the sunlight. His voice carried across the sudden silence. "That's far enough. You're trespassing in Esperanza, and I'm ordering you to leave peacefully." The lead rider laughed, a sound without humor. "We're not here for peace, Marshal. We're here for Vicente Carranza. Hand him over, and we'll ride out. Refuse, and we'll take him anyway over your dead bodies and anyone else fool enough to stand with you. Vicente Carranza is in territorial custody, awaiting trial for kidnapping and attempted murder," Wade said steadily. "He's not going anywhere, except to face justice." "Justice?" the rider spat. "There's no justice for Mexicans in gringo courts. There's only ropes and bullets. Vicente knows that. We know that. And now you're going to learn it too." The lieutenant's hand dropped to his gun, and the Battle of Esperanza began. The lieutenant drew first, his hand lightning fast, but Marshal Wade was already moving. The marshal's shot took the rider in the shoulder, knocking him sideways in his saddle. The street exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the Carranza gang opening up from their horses, the townspeople returning fire from windows and doorways. Bullets ricocheted off wooden walls, shattered glass, kicked up dust from the street. Horses screamed and reared, adding to the pandemonium. Old Hat fired from his position on the roof, his Henry rifle speaking with calm precision. He didn't waste shots. Each pull of the trigger was deliberate, aimed, effective. His first shot took down a rider aiming at the general store where 3 townsmen were positioned. His second shot spooked a horse whose rider was trying to flank the marshal's position. His third shot shattered the rifle of a gang member, drawing a bead on Thornton. Below him, Thornton worked his own rifle with grim determination, firing and reloading with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd accepted what needed to be done. He might not be a natural fighter, but he didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't let fear make his hands shake. The Carranza gang had expected an easy victory ride in, intimidate the locals, take what they wanted. They hadn't expected organized resistance, hadn't expected men willing to die defending their town. The surprise gave the townspeople a crucial advantage in those first chaotic minutes. 3 gang members went down in the opening exchange. 2 more broke off, their nerve failing when bullets started finding targets. The rest spurred their horses forward, trying to close the distance, make it harder for the defenders to shoot without hitting each other. "Barricades!" Old Hat shouted. "Fall back to the barricades!" the townsmen responded, retreating in good order to the wagon barriers they'd set up earlier. The barriers created choke points, forcing the riders to bunch up, limiting their maneuverability. Old Hat had learned that lesson. Fighting Comanche raiders 30 years ago, cavalry needed room to operate. Take that away, and horses became liabilities instead of advantages. A rider broke through the line, charging straight for the magistrate's office. Old Hat tracked him smoothly, led him by half a second, and fired. The rider tumbled from his saddle, and the horse veered away, running wild through the street. Scout burst from an alley where Old Hat had positioned him, snarling and snapping at another horse's legs. The animal panicked, bucking its rider off, then bolted. Scout didn't chase, just circled back to his position, ready for the next opportunity. The dog understood his role: create chaos, disrupt the enemy's coordination, protect the pack. Marshal Wade took a bullet in the arm, but kept fighting, switching his rifle to his offhand and continuing to fire with dogged determination. Old Hat saw the blood and adjusted his own position, covering the approaches to Wade's location, making sure no one could finish the wounded marshal. The battle compressed into a tight, brutal exchange centered on the magistrate's office and the jail behind it. The gang needed to reach those buildings to free Vicente. The townspeople needed to hold them back at any cost. Everything else, pride, fear, revenge, fell away, leaving only that simple, desperate struggle. Old Hat's rifle clicked empty. He ducked below the roofline, reloading with practiced speed, his fingers knowing the work even as his mind tracked the battle's flow. 9 gang members still fighting. 4 townsmen down, wounded or dead. The odds were evening out, but the gang still had momentum, still had the advantage of professional violence against amateur defenders. A bullet punched through the roof inches from Old Hat's head. Someone had spotted his position. He rolled left, came up firing, and saw the shooter on a neighboring roof. The man had climbed up to get a better angle, smart thinking but exposed. Old Hat's shot caught him in the chest, and the gang member fell backward, disappearing from view. "They're going for the jail!" Thornton shouted, pointing. 3 riders had broken off from the main fight, circling around toward the back entrance of the jail. If they reached Vicente, freed him, the battle's whole nature would change. Vicente was a leader, a tactician. With him directing the gang, the townspeople's amateur defense would crumble. Old Hat didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle and vaulted off the roof, landing hard, but rolling with the impact, coming up running. His 68-year-old body protested the abuse, muscles screaming, joints aching, but he ignored it all. Pain was temporary. Failure was permanent. He reached the jail's back entrance just as the first rider dismounted, reaching for the door. Old Hat's rifle came up, and he fired point blank. The rider went down. The second rider, seeing his companion fall, swung his pistol around, but Old Hat was already moving, closing the distance, using the rifle like a club. The stock connected with the rider's jaw, and the man dropped like a stone. The third rider wheeled his horse and charged, trying to ride Old Hat down. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Old Hat saw the horse's eyes, wide and white with fear, saw the rider's face, young and terrified, acting on orders he probably didn't even understand. Saw the barrel of the pistol coming around, aiming for his chest. Old Hat dropped flat, the horse thundering over him, hooves missing him by inches. He rolled, came up, and fired his revolver in one smooth motion. The rider jerked, grabbed his side, but stayed in the saddle, spurring his horse away from the fight, fleeing back toward the south. Old Hat picked himself up, breathing hard, and checked the jail door, still secure. Vicente was still locked inside, but the battle wasn't over. The remaining gang members, seeing their attempt to reach Vicente fail, regrouped in the center of the street. 6 riders left, all wounded to varying degrees, all realizing their easy victory had turned into a bloodbath. The lead, Lieutenant, the one Wade had shot in the shoulder, tried to rally them, shouting orders in Spanish, but Old Hat could see the doubt in their faces. These were hired guns, not true believers. They'd signed on for profit and intimidation, not for dying in the streets of a backwater town. Old Hat emerged from behind the jail, his revolver held steady. "It's over," he called out. "Vicente's staying locked up, and you boys are running out of reasons to die today. Ride out now, and you might live to see sunset." The lieutenant spat blood. "We don't leave our people behind." "Vicente wouldn't leave you behind," Old Hat said, his voice carrying across the street. He'd let every one of you die if it served his purpose. That's who he is. That's who he's always been. A man who uses people up and throws them away. One of the riders shifted uncomfortably. Old Hat could see the calculation happening, loyalty versus survival, pride versus common sense. The battle had been too costly, the resistance too fierce. Whatever they'd been promised, it wasn't worth this. Look around you. Old Hat continued. Your friends are dead or wounded. The town's still standing. Vicente's still locked up. What exactly are you accomplishing here, except getting yourselves killed? Another rider backed his horse up, creating distance. The lieutenant saw it and snarled, "Stand your ground, coward!" But it was too late. The spell was broken, the momentum lost. A second rider turned and spurred his horse toward the edge of town. Then a third. The lieutenant tried to stop them, but his voice was drowned out by the thunder of hooves as 4 of the remaining 6 riders fled, choosing life over loyalty. That left the lieutenant and one other man, a scarred veteran who looked too stubborn or too proud to run. They looked at each other, an entire conversation happening in that glance, and came to some agreement. They charged. Both men came at Old Hat from different angles, firing as they rode, trying to overwhelm him with crossfire. It was suicide, but it was the kind of suicide that came from knowing you'd already lost and deciding to go down fighting. Old Hat dove behind a water trough, bullets chewing into the wood. He came up firing, his revolver barking twice. The first shot hit the scarred veteran's horse, and the animal went down hard, throwing its rider. The second shot caught the lieutenant's good shoulder, sending him spinning from his saddle. Both men hit the ground, but were already scrambling for their weapons, refusing to quit. The veteran grabbed for a fallen rifle. The lieutenant, bleeding from both shoulders now, pulled a knife with his offhand and charged on foot. Old Hat fired again, but his hammer fell on an empty chamber. He'd lost count of his shots in the heat of battle, a mistake he'd normally never make. The lieutenant was 5 yards away, closing fast, knife raised. A rifle shot cracked from the magistrate's office. The lieutenant stumbled, looking down at the red bloom spreading across his chest. He took one more step, then collapsed. Old Hat looked up to see Thornton in the window, his rifle smoking. The magistrate's face was grim but resolved. He'd taken a life to save another, and he'd live with that weight. The scarred veteran, seeing his lieutenant fall, slowly raised his hands. "I'm done," he said hoarsely. "No more." Marshal Wade appeared, his left arm hanging useless but his right hand steady on his pistol. "Drop the weapon." "Hands where I can see them." The veteran complied, sinking to his knees. He looked exhausted, defeated, older than he probably was. "It was supposed to be easy," he muttered. "Ride in, scare some farmers, ride out with Vicente. Nobody said there'd be—" He gestured helplessly at the carnage around them. "Nobody ever thinks about what happens when people decide they've had enough," Old Hat said, approaching cautiously. "You picked the wrong town to terrorize." Other townsmen were emerging now, checking on the wounded, securing the surviving gang members. The battle was over. 8 gang members dead, 4 captured, 11 fled. On the town side, 3 dead, 7 wounded, but they'd held. Esperanza had survived. Old Hat made his way toward the church, his entire body aching, his hands shaking from adrenaline crash. Scout met him halfway, limping slightly but tail wagging. The dog had taken a graze across his shoulder but was otherwise intact. "Good boy," Old Hat murmured, scratching Scout's ears. "We made it, both of us." The church door opened, and 3 small figures came running out. Emma reached him first, followed by Clara, and even Beth, who threw her arms around his waist and held on tight. They were crying, all 3 of them, but it was relief more than fear. "You came back," Emma sobbed. "You promised, and you came back." "Always keep my promises when I can," Old Hat said, his throat tight. He looked past them to see Thornton approaching, and the 2 men shared a long look. They'd both survived. They'd both protected what mattered. And Vicente Carranza's vendetta was finally truly over. The territorial marshal arrived the next day with a proper escort to transfer Vicente to the capital for trial. Old Hat watched from the magistrate's porch as the prisoner was loaded into the armored wagon, still defiant, still venomous, but broken in all the ways that mattered. As the wagon pulled away, Old Hat touched the leather cord around his neck, where Sarah's ring rested, and whispered, "It's done, love. Finally done." 3 weeks later, Old Hat sat on the Thorntons' front porch as evening settled over Esperanza. The town had rebuilt what the battle had damaged: new windows in the general store, fresh paint on the saloon's false front, a memorial in the town square for the 3 men who'd given their lives defending their home. But the real rebuilding was happening in quieter ways, harder to see but more important. Beth was laughing. Again, chasing Scout through the garden, while Clara tried to teach them both a complicated game involving rope and stones. Emma sat beside Old Hat, reading aloud from a book of poetry, occasionally pausing to ask what a word meant, or to share her thoughts on a particularly moving verse. Thornton emerged from the house carrying a tray with coffee and fresh-baked bread. He'd been baking more lately, said it helped him process everything that had happened. The girls teased him about becoming a grandmother, but they ate every crumb of what he made. "Mail came today," Thornton said, settling into his chair. "Letter from the territorial governor. He wanted to thank us personally for taking down the Carranza gang. Says we've made the borderlands safer for everyone." "Political talk," Old Hat said mildly. "He's probably just glad someone else did the work for him." "Maybe, but he also authorized a reward, $500, to be split among those who defended the town." Thornton paused. "Your share would be about 150. Old Hat shook his head. "Give it to the families of the men who died. They need it more than I do." "I figured you'd say that." "Already did it." Thornton smiled slightly. "But there's something else. The town council met last night. They want to offer you a position. Deputy marshal, permanent posting, decent salary, room and board included." "I'm not a lawman anymore," Old Hat said automatically. The same thing he'd been saying for 10 years. "No, you're not. You're better than that." Emma looked up from her book, her expression serious. "You're not just about enforcing laws. You're about protecting people, helping them, making them feel safe. That's different. That's more important." Out of the mouths of 14-year-olds, Old Hat thought. When had she gotten so wise? "Papa needs help," Clara called from the garden, abandoning her game to join the conversation. "The real marshal's arm isn't healing right. Doctor, Cartwright says he might never have full use of it again, and there's still bad men out there. The Carranza gang is gone, but there's others." Beth, the quietest of the 3, approached and climbed into Old Hat's lap without asking permission. She was 8 years old and still recovering from trauma, but she'd chosen him as her safe person, her anchor. She snuggled against his chest and said softly, "Please don't leave us. We need you." Old Hat felt something crack in his chest, the careful walls he'd built around his heart, developing fissures. These weren't his daughters, this wasn't his family. He was just passing through, the way he always had been, the way he'd told himself he always would be. Except he'd been in Esperanza for 5 weeks now. He had a room at the boarding house that felt more like home than any place since Sarah died. He had dinner with the Thorntons most nights, and breakfast at least twice a week. He'd helped repair fences, taught Emma to shoot properly, showed Clara how to track animals, read bedtime stories to Beth when nightmares woke her. He'd stopped being a stranger and become something else, something that felt dangerously like family. Scout trotted over and laid his head on Old Hat's knee, brown eyes knowing and wise. The dog had been ready to move on weeks ago, but he'd stayed because Old Hat stayed. And if Old Hat was being honest with himself, Scout seemed happier here than he had in years of drifting. The dog had purpose again, protecting the girls, having consistent meals, sleeping on a soft rug instead of hard ground. "I'm 68 years old," Old Hat said quietly. "Getting too old for this kind of work." "You took down the Carranza gang with one dog and a plan," Thornton pointed out. "I'd say you've got plenty of good years left. What would Sarah want?" Emma asked, her insight cutting through his defenses. Your wife, what would she tell you to do? Old Hat thought about it, really thought about it. Sarah had never wanted him to stop being a ranger. She'd never asked him to choose between her and duty. What she'd wanted was for him to live fully, to let himself love and be loved, to not build walls between himself and the world. She'd hate what he'd become after her death, this closed-off drifter who kept everyone at arm's length, who never stayed long enough to put down roots, who confused isolation with honor. She'd tell me to stop being a stubborn old fool, he admitted. She'd tell me that running from pain doesn't heal it, that the only way through grief is forward, not around. So stay, Thornton said simply. Help us build something good here. Let us be your family, if you'll have us. Old Hat looked at the three girls, Emma with her poetry and fierce spirit, Clara with her gentle heart and creative mind, Beth with her slowly rebuilding trust and innocent joy. He thought about Sarah's wedding ring, still on its cord around his neck, and realized she'd want him to live for more than memory. I'll need to clear out my room at the boarding house, he said finally. If I'm staying permanent, I should probably find something more settled. Emma squealed and hugged him. Clara started crying happy tears. Beth just held on tighter, her small hands fisting in his shirt. Thornton's eyes were suspiciously bright. There's a small house on the edge of town. Belongs to old Charlie Henderson, but he moved to live with his daughter in Santa Fe. He'd probably sell it cheap to the right person. 2 bedrooms, decent yard for Scout, close enough to walk to the marshal's office. I'll look at it tomorrow, Old Hat said, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed and Thornton had retired to his study, Old Hat sat alone on the porch with Scout beside him. He pulled out his leather journal, the one filled with pressed flowers and wanted posters and notes from a life spent moving. On a fresh page, he began to write, Dear Sarah, I've found a place to stay, not just for winter but maybe longer. There's a town here that needs someone to watch over it, and 3 little girls who've decided I'm worth keeping around. I think you'd like them. They remind me of you, brave when they need to be, gentle when they can afford to be, full of hope even after seeing the worst life has to offer. I'm scared, love. Scared of getting attached and losing again, scared of failing these people who've put their trust in me. Scared of being too old, too broken, too stuck in my grief to be any good to anyone. But I think that's exactly why I need to stay, because fear means caring, and caring means living, and I've been just existing for too long. I'll always love you, always keep your memory close. But I think it's time I stopped drifting and started living again. I think you'd approve. Your faithful husband, Jebediah. He closed the journal and looked up at the stars, bright and endless above Esperanza. Scout's warm weight pressed against his leg. Somewhere inside the house, he could hear Beth talking in her sleep, Clara's soft breathing, Emma turning pages of her poetry book by lamplight. Home, he thought. After 10 years of wandering, he'd finally found his way home, and it felt right. Sometimes the measure of a man isn't what he keeps, but what he's willing to give up. But sometimes, Old Hat realized, it's also about what he's willing to accept: love, belonging, a second chance at the life he thought had ended with Sarah's death. The trail had led him here, to this porch, this town, these people who'd become family. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. There would be more challenges, more threats, more hard choices to make, but he wouldn't face them alone. He had Scout beside him, 3 girls who needed him, a magistrate who'd become a true friend, and a town that had decided he was worth fighting for. That was more than enough. That was everything.